Thank you. Ms. Lowey.
Mr. Attorney General, I want to get to some other items in the budget today because under current law, background checks must be done within 3 days or the transaction is allowed to proceed regardless of whether a person is lawfully permitted to buy a gun. In my judgment, it is vitally important that background checks are done thoroughly, as we know the results of incomplete information can be fatal. For example, we know that the shooter who perpetrated the Charleston shooting had passed a background check despite information that should have disqualified him. The House passed Enhanced Background Checks Act substantially increases the amount of time allowed for a NICS background check to ensure that we close these loopholes. I'm concerned that until this bill moves through the Senate and onto the President's desk, that 3 days is not often enough time to evaluate a background check with questionable information. In your judgment, would fewer prohibited individuals be able to purchase firearms if this time period was extended?
The data that I have heard is that there are about 6,000 of these delayed responses where these default sales occur after the expiration of the 3 days. And that when you go back and look at those 6,000, approximately 2,000 of those, about a third, are people that would have flunked the background check, and their ATF goes out and gets the weapon, retrieves the weapon. I think it's fairly rare that, well, I think that the Aurora shooter may have been someone who got that default sale, that, you know, that it was sold to them after the 3-day period. So it does occasionally happen.
Wait a minute, occasionally, didn't you mention 2,000, 6,000?
Well, they're not all shooters. In other words, it does sometimes happen that somebody
Do you support extending the time period? I've had an interaction with so many people in law enforcement, and in many cases, 3 days is just not enough. Do you support extending the time period?
No. I think that, you know, that puts a burden on a lot of people.
Who may be buying a gun that shouldn't have a gun. Is that what you're saying? When you're saying it puts a burden on a lot of people,
I think
I'd rather put a burden on those who are doing the investigation than the
I would put the
potential
emphasis.
shooters.
I would put the emphasis on getting accurate records put into the system, and make sure that we're getting all the records into the system. I think a far bigger problem is the problem of mental health. That is another elephant in the room. That's where all these school shootings are arising from. And we have to figure out a way of upgrading the NICS system so it actually helps us to detect people with mental illness that should not have guns. And I think we should be investing in NICS, the accuracy of the records, the obligations of states to put those records into the system, and make that a stronger, not a stronger system, one that we can rely on. That's where I would put the effort.
I'm not sure what you mean by a stronger system. In other words, if one of your colleagues was doing a study and looking at a background check and said, I need 3 more days, do you feel that person should have 3 more days, 2 more days, 6 more days? Isn't it more important to get a good, thorough background check than limiting the office to 3 days?
What I was saying is that the better job we do of getting the records into the system, we won't have those 3-day, you know, that the level of a 3-day default sale. I mean, you mentioned sometimes federal agencies are not putting the appropriate records in, as we saw, you know, with the Air Force situation. Sometimes state agencies are not putting the records in, so there are gaps in the records.
Let me go on to the next question.
That's a far more important thing to address.
Let me go on to the next question. I do hope we can continue this conversation another time. You have referred to the Violence Against Women Act as a bad idea and not in the legitimate interest of the federal government. These are investments that fund services for victims of domestic abuse and sexual assault that many of my constituents, including those trapped in cycles of domestic violence and looking for a way out, rely on. Under Republican leadership in the previous Congress, maybe I'll just wait a minute. The authorization of the Violence Against Women Act was allowed to expire despite bipartisan support. Thankfully, last week, the reauthorization passed the House, again with bipartisan support. During your confirmation hearing, you changed your position and supported VAWA's programs, pledging to familiarize yourself with the office, its work, and its program. I was delighted to hear that. So I'd be interested in knowing whether you support the reauthorization of VAWA, and do you support the House-passed reauthorization bill?
I do support the reauthorization of Violence Against Women Act. I'm not sure about the House bill and what's in it, but I do support the reauthorization of that provision. Let me say that to the extent I said something against the Violence Against Women statute, I believe that that was in the context of it when it originally came up, 2.5 decades ago or 30 years ago, somewhere in that range. And what I said was that in that point it was a substantive law relating to the penalty, federalizing certain acts of violence against women, and that was eventually struck down as not having a sufficient Commerce Clause basis. I think that's what my concern with the Violence Against Women's Act was many, many years ago. It was a different kind of act. I fully support what we're doing right now on violence against women.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted that you support the current actions, and I'm glad to know that there was good